What's your name and age?
My name is Paddy Screech. I'm one of the owners of Word on the Water, the London book barge, and I'm 58 years old.
How long have you lived on the cannibals?
I first moved onto a boat about 17 years ago, and I live in a little 40-foot narrow boat, which I keep outside London. I move it. You have to move your boat every 2 weeks. So I move up and down the rivers in Hertfordshire, about 30 miles outside London in the country. I went up for lockdown and I never came back. So I wake up in a forest on the canal, and then I drive a motorbike to London to come to work.
Where did your cannibals come from?
The one that we use as a bookshop is a Dutch barge, and it was built in 1920, so it's 103 years old. And originally that came from Amsterdam in Holland. When it was first made, it was a coal barge. It was to carry coal. And then in the 1960s, someone turned it into a houseboat. And then we turned it into a bookshop when we opened, which was about 13 years ago.
Okay. How do you get power and energy on a canal boat?
In the old days, that was very hard. Nowadays, boats are kind of at the forefront of using sustainable energy, because it's very difficult to plug into the electricity if you're on a boat that moves every 2 weeks. So nearly all boats have solar panels on the roof, and for 8-9 months of the year, free electricity. We also have, our engines have alternators. So we have a diesel engine, and when we run the engine, it also is charging the batteries on the boat as well. So if the solar panels don't do it, you just turn your engine on and wait for an hour, and that fills you up with electricity. Heating is still the Victorian way. So we all have stoves, these sort of coal stoves. Just in recent years, people have started to use diesel because there is less emissions from diesel. There is less particulate matter. So, and we have hot water, like in a house. You have a sink and a shower, and that runs from a boiler that comes off a big gas bottle. And there are still men who ply up and down the river on big canal boats, and they sell coal and they sell gas and they sell diesel. And so maybe once every week or 2 weeks, the coal boat comes, you hear the engine, and you go out and you order your coal.
How to cook?
Yeah, normal. We have most boats have a normal cooker, like you would have in a house, a gas cooker, and you just cook in like in a normal house.
How and where to take out the trash?
That's an issue on the canal system, because there is an organisation called the Canal and River Trust who run the canal system, and one of the things they do is they provide places for people to throw their rubbish away. So you collect rubbish in your boat in rubbish bags, and you store it, and then when you get to a place where you're allowed to get rid of your rubbish, you put your rubbish bags in there. But there are not enough of those places on the canal, and so it is a little bit difficult, because often you are carrying 5-6 bags of rubbish, and in the summer that can be a bit smelly. So there is always a conversation between the boaters and the Canal and River Trust about why there aren't enough resources for people who live on boats.
Would the canal boats stay parked along the canal?
There are 2 ways you can be on the canal. You can either have a permanent mooring, which is like a parking space that you never leave, like your home, and you will pay money, you will rent this one place, and often they will put in electricity and a tap, and you will have water there. And that is quite expensive. That's like hiring a flat in London. It's the same sort of money. But there is an ancient law going all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century, I think even the 18th century. So the reason we have canals in Britain is because they were the first industrial transportation system. So when the Industrial Revolution happened, and suddenly there were factories and weaving mills in the north of England. And because of the slave trade, there was cotton coming into Liverpool and the ports in the north west of Britain. Something was needed to then transport that stuff to London and around the rest of the country. And this was before railways had been invented, because railways were invented in Britain about 100 years later. And so they built the canal system as a way of moving heavy loads throughout Britain. And at that time, they made it a law that a family could live on a boat. It was illegal for them to live on a boat, provided the boat was kept moving. And that was to sort of make the status of the families that were the original boat dwellers, the bargees, to make their legal status secure. They were allowed to be on their boats. They wouldn't be sort of told they had to leave their boats. And that law is still in place, which means in Britain it's possible, it's legal to live on your boat, provided it moves to a different place every 2 weeks. So in Holland, that is not allowed. You must stay on a permanent mooring, but in Britain you are allowed to live like a gypsy and move from place to place, which is what I have done for 17 years. So I move across 20 miles of river, basically, moving every 2 weeks.
What ways and routes are available to sail?
I mean, there aren't as many as there were 200 years ago, because after the war in the 1940s and 50s, when they were rebuilding the country after all the bombing, they turned a lot of the canals into roads because they did not have to duplicate the engineering. They had already cut through the hill to make a canal, so they just put a road where the canal was. So many canals were lost in the 50s and 60s and 40s. But you can still go from London all the way up to Leeds and Manchester, to Oxford, to Cambridge. There's a beautiful canal that runs from London all the way across to South Wales. There are canals in North Wales. So a lot of the country is available by waterways, and there are rivers that you can go on as well. You can go on the Thames in London, though on a narrowboat it is a little bit dangerous and exciting, because narrowboats are not designed not to roll, because they're just designed to sit on canals. So when you go on the Thames, it can be a bit like, yeah. Yeah, many waterways in Britain. For 20 years before I was a bookseller, I worked with homeless people and with people with addictions. And I was a psychotherapist, a counsellor. And then in the later years of that part of my career, I became a manager. So I ran treatment centres for homeless people and people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. And I stopped that about 13, 14 years ago and started selling books instead. I took my own advice, which was find a way to be happy now.
Why not choose to buy or rent a house?
I never had much interest in buying a house. Houses in Britain it's gone crazy. They're far too expensive, and there's too much money. It seems unhealthy. And I would never have that much money. I worked for the government looking after homeless people, and then I run a little bookshop, and neither of those generate the sort of income that enables you to spend the £500,000 to £1 million that you have to spend to buy a house in London. But also I get depressed in houses. I am a nomad. I feel somewhere I need to move. I travel a lot in my life before I moved onto the canals as well. And I really like the small scale thing about a boat. It's so simple. If I do not like my neighbour, I just drive away. I do not have to complain and have an argument, and I do not have a landlord, and I do not have to pay rates to the council, and it feels really natural. And I grew up in natural land, in country, in Devon, in the southwest of England. And the boat means that I can live in the country, really in the country. Like I can wake up in a field, or I can wake up in a forest, on a lake or something, even though I work in the middle of London. So I had never had any interest in buying a house. And the advantage of living on a boat, especially in London, where everything is so expensive, is that it's really cheap. Once you've got your coal and you are warm and you have your gas, and that's all you pay. You do not. So I'm as rich as my friends who have houses who earn 4 times what I earn, because they have to give all this money to a mortgage broker or to a company or to a bank, or whereas I don't have to deal with any of that. So when I earn my money, it's my money. I can spend it for my life. I don't have to give it to some corporation.
What should ordinary people do if they want to live on a canal boat?
So my first bit of advice is you can go on a canal boat holiday for a week or 2 weeks where you live on a narrowboat and it's all set up for you. So you hire the boat, basically. They show you how to drive it. It's not very difficult. And then you just disappear for 2 weeks and you drive your boat and you live on it. So you can work out whether you want to do that and whether that does feel like the sort of life that you want. If you do that and you love it, it's possible to get on a narrowboat for as little as £15,000 probably, as a starter, maybe 20. So you save is what you do. But it doesn't take long to save £15,000 compared to the £40,000 you'd need to put down a deposit to even begin to think about having a house. And of course, once you've paid that, you own it. It's finished, no more money. It's yours. You are a homeowner. And asking people on boats, going and saying hello, walking along the canal, talking to people, asking their advice. There's also a large Facebook group called London Boaters, where all the people who live on boats are on this group. And you can go onto that as the public and you can ask questions about living on a boat, or if anyone knows of boats for sale. And if you care enough and you really do want to do it, you will do it.
What kind of license is required? How to get it?
There's you need one. You pay for a license to have your boat on the canal, and you pay it once a year, and it's about £1,000 for the whole year. The requirements of that license are that you move according to the rules that the organisation sets down, and that once every 4 years you do a safety certificate, which is like an MOT on a car, where a specialist comes and just makes sure that your boat is safe to live in and safe to drive on the canals, and you do any maintenance work that you must to ensure that it passes that test. But apart from that, you just pay £1,000 a year.
Are there any permissions required?
To live on a boat, apart from that license and that safety certificate thing, you don't need. There's no lesson in how to drive the boat. There's no sort of driving license or anything like that. You must move it every 2 weeks. You must move a minimum of sort of 20 miles a year. You have to carry on moving in the same direction for a long time before you can turn around. It's over-regulated. We think the reason they want to make all these rules is because the organisation that runs the canals would much rather people didn't move, that they just stayed still and paid them 10 times as much money to live on a boat. Because that £1,000 you pay for a year to move your boat every 2 weeks, you'll pay that every month if you stay still. It's much more expensive to live on a mooring. And so, yes, but provided you move in the way they want you to and you keep your boat safe according to the rules, after that, you're free.
Do you think young British people will choose to live on canal boats in the future?
They already have. When I moved onto the canal, it was almost empty. Now it is full to bursting. And many of those people are young people. Young people particularly like living on a boat in London because their parents can buy them a boat, and then for the 3-4 years they may be doing a university course. They live on a boat, they own a boat, they don't have to pay rent to some landlord, they don't have to have a house share with 9 other people because they can't afford the rent. So for the parents' point of view, it's great because you can sell the boat at the end of it, and your child has lived in London maybe in zone one for 4 years, 3 years, and then when you've sold the boat, you get all the money back, so it's free. So that's one reason why young people like boats. But there's something deeper happening. This is the first generation of young people in my lifetime who are not excited by technology and not excited by the future, and are seeking old truths and old technology and things that have worked for 100 years, 1,000 years, and are looking to also to find ways of living that are sustainable. And because solar power and living off grid and living in a very small scale way, these are the ways that we need to live in the future. And so once there is a better infrastructure of sustainable electricity along the canal so that people do not have to have coal fires anymore, it's a very modern way of living. So yes, I think young people will continue. It's a craze at the moment. It's not that people maybe think about living on the canal. It's gone mad. The canal system is full in Britain because everyone wants to live on a canal, because it seems to be all the things that people want nowadays. There's a thing about community as well. I think that living in a city, you don't really know your neighbours because you don't want to be friends and say hello, because if you don't like them, you'll never get rid of them. And it's not like the 1930s where people needed their neighbours, because if you need a thing, you just order it from Amazon. Whereas on the boats, it is different. On the boats, no one has all the tools that you need to make a boat work all the time, and no one has all the expertise. And there are women who live alone, and they need support from other people to sort of be safe, and so it makes authentic community, because community is actually, it isn't like a sort of hippie thing where it's nice to have friends. Community happens when people need each other, and on the canal system you need other boaters far more than people in houses in cities need each other. And so I think that's another thing that people like about the canal system, that it's easier to make human connections with people, and it's easier to not have arguments with people because your houses can just drive away from each other. So you don't, if someone annoys you on Tuesday, you don't have to put up with them on Wednesday, because you can drive a mile away and you may not see them for another year. So yeah, there's much is good about canal life, and I think it has much, like so much about sustainable living. It's old fashioned, and I think the future is old fashioned too. We hope the future will be old fashioned.
If you had the choose again, would you still live on a boat?
I choose to live on a boat every day, and I want to live on a boat until I die. The only thing that would stop me being on a boat is that my body makes it too difficult to do it. I cannot walk or something. But no, I will live on a boat forever.
Tell us about your bookshop, World on the Water. How did you come up with this idea?
So the first person I met when I bought my boat, and I drove it to London, to Hackney, and I parked it, and next to me on the boat next door, on a tired old ex-police boat, was my friend John, who became my very best friend. And the two of us together decided about 14 years ago that we would try to be bargees instead of boaters. A boater is someone who lives on a boat or spends the days on a boat. A bargee is the name they gave in the Industrial Revolution to the people who lived and worked on the canal system all their time. They never left the canal system. And we wanted to be bargees. We wanted to find a way to make a living from being on the canal, rather than just have it as a sort of nice home and go to work in some office or something. And the thing we both knew about was books, because John had a postgraduate degree in American literature, and I did English at Oxford. And so between the two of us, we decided we would sell books. And John had been selling books for 30 years, and sort of street corners and makeshift tables and pavements, and He'd been homeless and a heroin user and a crack user, and even then he sold books on the street. But by the time I met him, he had a big market stall that he was running in London. So we decided to try and do it on my little narrowboat and see if it would work. But while we were making our plans, that beautiful Dutch barge that's the bookshop was parked on the other side of the river, and it belonged to a friend of ours called Noy. And he had bought the boat but couldn't afford to keep the boat. His plan was to buy it and just sell it and make some money, but he fell in love with it because it's a beautiful 1920s Dutch barge. So he could not sell it, but he needed help to pay the license. So John and I went and we talked to him and we asked him if we could maybe rent it for a year and do an experiment of running a bookshop on the boat. But he is a bit of a visionary himself and said, no, I will give us the boat, and I will build a stage on the roof and we will do live performance, and I will come in as a full partner. So the three of us made a partnership together to do this experiment and see if we could be a floating bookshop. There was a bookshop in London 30, 40 years ago on a boat, which I think was called the Book Barge, which was a children's bookshop that was parked in Greenwich. And so we didn't invent the idea, but that boat closed 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So we thought it might be something that people liked, but we didn't know practically whether it would work. So we opened in 2011, and then we spent 7 years moving around the canal system, doing the moving every 2 weeks thing like the rule says. And it was very difficult. It was lovely, but it was hard to make it pay enough money for 3 men. We would have days where we had to choose between cigarettes and coffee because we couldn't afford both. It was not very commercial, but people slowly got to know us all over London where we'd turn up. And eventually we begged for a permanent home, a mooring, and the Canal Authority would not give us one, because where we used to park we would have live jazz playing on the roof, musicians, or poetry events, and the people in the houses would complain about the noise. So the Canal Authority did not like us because they thought we were like a party boat. And they are in Leeds, they are not in London, so they had not seen the boat. So they just thought we were some sort of London noise polluting young people's sort of party thing. But eventually we announced on our social media that we were going to have to close because we weren't making enough money, because we couldn't park where there were people enough of the time, because we could spend 2 weeks in a place where there were lots of people, but then we'd have to move away again. And if you go to a bookshop and you like it, when you go back to the bookshop, if it has disappeared, it's very upsetting. And so it was hard for us to build up following. And the only place we had followers was online, where you had to go to find out where we were. But that meant we had followers online. So when we said that we were going to close, our followers online suddenly, like all, woke up and started writing letters to newspapers and to the Canal and River Trust. And then we got on television, and then we appeared in Private Eye, which is a very famous satirical magazine. And then the Canal and River Trust, or the authority on the canal, started getting a lot of criticism that they were closing the little bookshop. And eventually they gave us a telephone call and they said, okay, you can have a permanent home. Where do you want it to be? So we said we'd like it to be in King's Cross, and we came here. And then in the years since we arrived, Granary Square has been built, this entire complex full of like shops, and the world famous art college, St Martin's is here, and the British Library is there, the Guardian newspaper. And suddenly we realise we're in the best possible place in London to be selling books on a boat. There's not many places on the canal system that are perfect. And also we can make as much noise as we want here and no one complains because we're in this big open basin. And so since we came here to Granary Square next to King's Cross, we do really well. And we also, to our surprise, as we never planned it, we're huge on TikTok and we're huge on Instagram. I went on TikTok and just put Word on the Water into the search bar, and the first thing that came up had 5.5 million views. And so all the time we're being advertised to people, which is lovely, because we're just a small, old-fashioned, tiny bookshop the size of a shoe, and yet somehow people in Taiwan and Australia and Atlanta and Italy come and say, oh, I had to come, I saw it on my social media at home. And so we're quite lucky old men now.
Do you see the future of the bookshop? And when you retire, would you close it?
I will not retire. The good thing about a bookshop is you can pretty much do it forever, because most of the work involves sitting on a seat talking to people about books, which I'd be very happy to do until my last day. It's a good time for bookshops. It's the opposite of what everyone thought. Everyone thought the bookshops would die because Amazon and Kindles were going to replace books, and that after 5,000 years we didn't want books now. And when we started, we were a little bit worried that maybe no one would be buying books 2 years later and we'd become like a cassette tape shop or something. What's happened in Britain and in Australia and in Canada is that there's been an explosion of people liking bookshops, and people are buying more normal hard books, proper books, rather than digital books than ever before. New bookshops are opening in England all the time, and that's because bookshops are more than shops where you buy books. They're community projects, and they're resources for people, they're live performance venues, and they're places where authors can meet readers in person, and they're places where people can go on dates, which are safe and friendly. And people don't like algorithms to tell them what books to read. They want humans to recommend books to them, because these are books. You don't want an algorithm to tell you what thoughts to have based on what thoughts you had yesterday, because they'll just feed you the same thoughts again and again. That's the trouble with algorithms. They just send you down this narrowing corridor. And so people really like human curation. So it turned out that Amazon didn't get to take over the entire book industry of the world, because there are things they just couldn't do. They couldn't be friendly and small and community based, and they couldn't be humans recommending books to humans, and so bookshops are exploding. So I don't think commercially there's any reason why our little bookshop shouldn't go on for another 100 years. I don't want it to stop just because I stop, and it'll take me becoming disabled or dying to stop me doing it now. And the bookshop isn't just us. The bookshop's a community now of about 25 people that make it work all the time. Musicians and someone who does the flowers, and I've got about 4 or 5 different people curating the books, choosing what books go in the shop, and we've got a little family of volunteers that sell books for us during the day. And so is kind of, I hope it'll never stop, and I hope bookshops themselves never stop too, because you don't want to sit and read a Kindle with your child.